being in the intensive care unit or being in the EICU, where I'm monitoring hospitals all over a 6-state region, is like drinking out of a fire hose. I mean, this can be quiet sometimes, but that's not the usual situation. The usual situation is it just comes at you from the time you walk through the door until the time you leave. So you have to have some way to decompress. So our shifts are not atypical. Most places I've ever been, the critical care shifts are 12-hour shifts or 24-hour on-call, believe it or not. When I was a fellow, we took over the ICU on Monday morning and we were on call until the following Monday. So we did 7 straight days from 5 in the morning until probably 7 at night, and then we would sleep for a while and try to get home and get some sleep and then be back at it the next day. It was actually pretty crazy. So during work, actually, you have to take a deep breath and sort of step out of the unit periodically when you can, just to sit down and grab something to eat or take a walk a little bit, because 12 hours, drinking out of a fire hose, patient after patient after patient, you gotta take a break. If you don't take a break, actually, you get to the point where you're not really useful to anybody. So short term, that kind of stuff. Long term, it's a whole nother story. When I was a fellow, I think if you spoke to any physician in cardiology or critical care or trauma surgery or the components of medicine that are high pressure, high intensity, I think most of us would tell you that the craziest times in our life was during our fellowship and during our training, because it's a lot of hours. And the other thing is that when you're in that part of your fellowship, you know the least that you're going to know in your career, and yet you might have the most responsibility. It's a funny combination, actually, because as a fellow, you know a lot as a fellow, but experience has a place. There are things now that I do that when I was a fellow would take a lot of energy, and now they're just routine. They're not routine to people who don't know critical care. If they walked in the unit and they saw what we do, they would shake their head. But at this point, it's just not a big deal, whereas when I was a fellow, it was a very big deal. Whether you're a critical care physician or do any kind of medicine or any kind of intense work in your profession, I think you have to have a way to unhook. If you don't do that, you get to the point where you're so focused and so obsessed that you're not very good to people, both to the people you work with and the people you live with. Ask my wife, and in my case, the patients I take care of. Plus, you lose fun in your life. So I've always thought you have to have outlets, and not just sort of little passive outlets, but things you're really passionate about, that you really care about, that you look forward to. I think that's really the key. So for example, when I'm in the ICU, I'm working hard, but if it's a sunny day and I know my bike's in the hallway, and when I finish my shift and I look out the window and it's not raining, I'm thinking about that as well. I mean, it helps me get through the day. So you have to do things. I ride a bike a lot, actually, and have done some pretty crazy long rides. 3 years ago, rode 630 miles from Sioux Falls over to South Bend, Indiana to help raise money for this organization, and that was a 630 miles in 6 days deal. And I thought the temperatures for that ride would be in the mid-50s, and it never got over 35 or 40 the whole way. And then last year, a friend of mine and I did another fundraiser. We rode 5 of the biggest climbs in Colorado. So that part of it's adventure. And now Tuesday, a couple days from now, or at some point in the near future, I'll be climbing on this bike again and trying to raise additional money to help finish building this hospital in Ecuador. And this one, I tell people the other ones are fun. This one might be a little crazy. This one we're going to ride from the Mexican border to the Canadian border along the Continental Divide. And we'll cross the Continental Divide 34 times between the time we leave Mexico and hopefully make it to the north. So it's not so much that I want that's useful to talk about that. It's just the point is that it's got to be something you really love and you like training for, you like doing. It's not just biking too. I mean, we're filming today, we're talking today, on our 40-acre property that we're so fortunate to have. And we built a passive solar home. We've taken what used to be corn and beans and turned it back into, native prairie. We planted 3,000 trees and built a dam for a small pond. And, so we come home, and my wife and I, who's a physician as well, we get out of our doctor clothes and we get into our dirt digging farmer clothes and climb in the pickup and go up on the ridge and plant trees. I just think to stay healthy and to stay useful and to stay focused and centered, you have to have some way to disconnect from the intense work that you do. Yeah, well, so this one that starts, in a few days, it'll be one other person, who's a good friend of mine who I actually did my residency with, who lives in Portland. It'll be two of us. And then his brother will provide support. So we'll have a backup van with all of our gear and all of our spare parts and all of that, and we'll head north. It'll be the two of us. So for this organization, we are opening this new hospital and clinic in a community of 500,000 people on June 27th. And I say 500,000 people, and you would think that that's a city. And it's not a city, actually. It's in rural Ecuador. It's just a big rural place with a lot of people. And we've had to raise $8 million to buy the land and build the hospital and build the training center and that sort of thing. So we've raised money by every which way that you could imagine, and one of them is this bike adventure. And I got to tell you that it never occurred to me, I mean this seriously, it never occurred to me when I came up with the idea to start doing these bike rides that we could actually raise money off of these things. I seriously just never thought. I thought maybe we'd raise, a couple $100. We raised a lot of money, and who? For the bike rides, mostly individuals. People who get caught up in the whole adventure and understand what we're trying to do it for. Beyond the bike ride, there's the usual large donors, foundations, that sort of thing. I can tell you it's kind of interesting. On the ride across to South Bend in October 2 years ago, I had looked at the weather patterns, and the consistent average temperature that at the end of the year, end of October, was 52 degrees. But that was right when that big hurricane came up the East Coast, and so it changed the weather patterns. So instead of southerlies, that hurricane swept up the eastern seaboard and then came down from the north and had 28-foot waves on Lake Michigan and winds blowing from the north and from the northeast the whole way. When I left here, I was by myself. When I left here on a Friday morning, it was 26 degrees outside. And I pedaled away in the dark, heading across Sioux Falls. We had already raised about $52,000 before I left off of pledges. And people watched the blog at night and got the updates. And every one of the pictures was me in hats, gloves, facial masks, hunched over, wind blowing. And we raised an additional $17,000 just on the days that we were riding. And I'm convinced it's because people went on the blog and saw this ridiculous guy, freezing with icicles coming off my ears, So the answer to your question is, crazy people who get involved and get interested in this kind of stuff. So the organization is called Andean Health and Development. And the way that I got involved is that I had done and continue to do a fair amount of work outside of the United States, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And then 15 years ago, the former president of the University of Notre Dame, who had been and still is a mentor, called me at my office at that point in Atlanta at Emory University and said, I've got this enthusiastic young guy, Notre Dame grad, who's trying to help improve rural health in Ecuador. Can you lend a hand? The fellow's name was Father Ted Hesburgh. And anybody who knows Father Ted Hesburgh knows that it's almost impossible to say no to him. And I told him I would help for 6 months, and here I am 15 years later. So Andean Health has been in existence for 15 years, and the basic concept, which is what makes this so unusual in the international development community, is that the hypothesis, the idea that small communities in rural Latin America have enough expendable income that if they use it in a careful, thoughtful way, they can actually sustain their own small hospital and health system. That they don't need, endless, infusion of dollars from outside of the country. And secondly, that they can have quality health care in their own community and not have to go to the capital every time someone's, in trouble. And when the founder of the organization came up with that idea, everyone thought he was crazy. Because if you go to Ecuador, I mean, it's not sub-Saharan Africa, but rural Ecuador and rural Latin America still can be pretty bleak. It's an emerging economy, they're great folks, mostly agrarian, so there's not a lot of expendable dollars around. And so the idea that you could build a hospital and build health clinics and have a health system and it could fund itself into perpetuity, everyone thought he was crazy. And yet his idea turned out to be exactly right. The goal was for this hospital, which opened in 2000, the goal was for it in a little community called Pedro Vicente Maldonado. The goal was that it would be self-sufficient by 2007. And in fact, it became self-sufficient a year earlier, and it's been completely self-sufficient on its own, completely run by Ecuadorians from the beginning. So that was the first project, and now in Santo Domingo, this community of 500,000, we've gone upscale and built a large training center, and the first hospital was 16 beds, this is 65 beds. The first community was 70,000, this one's 500,000. We began a residency program for family medicine residents at the first hospital. We're now in a partnership with the Ministry of Health. We're training 100 residents a year. I mean, you know, just think about what that really requires to train 100 residents. And here's one of the interesting things for me. Turns out that a lot of the issues that we deal with in rural Ecuador, in terms of how do you find physicians and nurses who really want to live and work in rural communities and take care of the needs of rural populations, no surprise, turns out that those are the same issues that we wrestle with in the Northern Plains and here in South Dakota. How do we find quality nurses and physicians who really want to build a career and raise their family in small, rural communities? So we're learning a lot from what we do in South Dakota that's applicable there, and we're learning a lot from how we're trying to manage that in Ecuador that might be useful here. So it's a nice combination. Why do I do this? Why are my wife and I involved with this organization in Ecuador? Why do we ride bikes? But more specifically, this kind of work that we do in Ecuador. And I always tell people because I'm selfish. I mean, I really say that to people. They say, why do you do this? And I say, because I'm selfish. Because we get back so much more. I know this is what people always say, but it turns out that it's absolutely true. My life is so much richer because of the people that I know from biking and the people that I know from Ecuador. I can't even quantify it. So the answer is, why do I do it? What do I get out? It provides a great deal of personal satisfaction and sense of well-being. That we've been lucky enough to have these gifts come our way and then have found a way somehow to turn them back around and make them useful to somebody else. That's an incredible gift. So my life is rich because of it. And the biking part's just a blast. The biking part lets me raise a lot of money for these folks in Ecuador. Who would have ever figured that? So I'll tell you one thing. So when I get on my bike, for example, if I were just getting on the bike next week to start pedaling north because it was an athletic adventure, that's a little self-centered, don't you think? I mean, really. But because I know I'm doing it and I've got the opportunity to help raise some serious dollars for this thing, it takes it to a whole nother level. It gets beyond me. And when I'm on these training rides, and it's South Dakota, is there ever a training ride in South Dakota that's not a windy day? I mean, seriously. But when I get out and it's cold and I really don't want to be on the bike and I really am tired of the gol darn wind in this state of ours, I just remember that if I keep cranking, I'll have a chance to pull this thing off with my friends and will be useful to somebody. So that's a good deal.